Welcome. I'm Riley Karsh.
I'm Tova Kopan.
We are thrilled to bring you the We Go Boldly podcast.
Let's talk big burning questions, life changes, and maybe a bit of personal business.
Let's be bold and brave together. Are you ready?
I am. Here comes the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to We Go Boldly, the podcast. We are very, very excited to have you with us today. We are recording on Valentine's Day. Tova just asked me where my red is, and I was like, I don't know. I love Valentine's Day in the sense of I love love, and I love all kinds of love, every form of love. I think it's great. I just don't like celebrating it one time a year. I want to do it all the time. So take that for what you will. Anyway, it is season 10. We are how-toing, and today we are talking all about my favorite topic that Tova researched for today, and that is boundaries. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of boundaries, Tova, let me welcome you to the show and see how you're doing today. What's happening?
Well, I love all the years of the days of the year as well.
Yep.
But I also love holidays.
Yes, you do. And I love that you love holidays.
So somehow the boys got presents today. I don't know how. I planned on going to a bookstore to buy them stickers, and instead they all got books.
Yeah.
Because, how do you not buy books? And we got a family puzzle because, once again, how do I resist a puzzle? I don't know. It's a local bookstore, so how do you resist supporting a local bookstore? I mean, all my boundaries were coming down.
Yeah, it snowballed.
Yeah, it's a porous boundary. We'll learn more about those. So I do love and Valentine's Day. I like it more now that I have no romantic expectations from it.
Yeah, I could see that. See that.
So it's just like about the kids, and that's it.
Right.
Like, that's it.
Right. Yeah, my kids get chocolate every year. Like I give them a little box of chocolate, or this year I gave them, I don't know, a little like tube of chocolate. I don't know.
Yeah, my kids got like a little heart with M&Ms, some chalky candy that they won't like, and hopefully I'll get to eat because I love those chalky candies. And some a ring pop because they like ring pops.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but we had a snow day yesterday, which is exciting because we haven't had one of those in a long time.
We did, and it was a lot of snow, which we
Yeah,
haven't had,
like,
I think, in 2 years. So
yeah.
that
It was
pretty
real snow.
exciting.
It's melting right now, which makes me a little sad, but it's not gonna all melt today.
Oh, well, that makes me happy that it's melting. But I digress. Let's dive into boundaries. Let's do it.
Let's jump in.
Yeah.
We have done a lot of episodes about boundaries, and
a lot of personal work around boundaries.
And a lot of
let's
personal
be very clear.
work around them. And we have a workshop on boundaries. So we really are going to try to talk to the basics and the how to set them.
Yeah.
And I'm going to talk about definitions, but I want to talk about this. I guess it's sort of a definition. It's a great way to think of boundaries. It hit me. And I don't know, maybe it hit you too, because I think you bolded it when you were reviewing the outline, which is at their core, boundaries are all about who we give power to.
Yeah. This really
it got me right here.
Like, we're both like,
yeah.
It really hit home for me.
Admittedly, Riley just read the outline because I just sent it to her moments ago. So, but when I read it, I was like, oh, and what I like about it is because we're going to talk about setting boundaries for ourselves, right? I sent you a funny meme that somebody else sent me. Actually, one of the women in our women's circle sent me this morning about no worries for you because I will take all your worries.
Yes.
And that's a personal boundary that you set for yourself, being like, I'm not going to take on your anxiety. I'm not going to take on your worries. But it's about keeping that power to yourself, right? It was like exploding brain. Very exciting.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated that that description because I think it will help a lot of people understand what they're giving away when they're not setting boundaries and what they're not, keeping for themselves that they ought to be or deserve to be.
Yeah, and this is a little more sort of a straightforward definition. Boundary is a limit or edge that defines you as separate from others. Here's another. Boundaries are the separations that humans need mentally, emotionally, and physically to feel safe, valued, and respected. And I love that
Yeah.
one so much too, because it is stated as a human need, right? It's not
Yes.
an option. It's not like, wouldn't it be nice if I could set
Yeah, it's
boundaries?
not just a want. It's like
Yeah,
you
it's a
need this
human
for
need.
functioning.
And feeling safe and valued. Well, feeling safe is the bottom of the pyramid, right?
Right.
Like at your core, you have to feel safe. You can't really worry about anything else if you don't feel safe.
Yeah.
And I don't know if like food and shelter is actually below it, but to me, sometimes even if you have the food and shelter, if you don't feel safe, like you're willing to give up the food and shelter to feel safe.
Yeah,
So
and you spend a lot of time seeking out that safety, right? Like
right.
speaking from, personal experience, when you don't feel safe in your relationships or your
Yep.
environment, then nothing else really matters. So I don't know,
Hmm.
Tova, maybe I would put it at the very bottom
To
of
me, it
the
is. I mean,
pyramid.
because I think we've seen people leave bad relationships not knowing about the shelter or the food
Yeah, or
because
just not knowing where they're going to end up or what's going to happen. Yeah.
yeah. So and I like this idea though of also then beyond safety, feeling valued and respected, which is what
Yeah.
we all want, whether it's in work or friendship, romantic relationships, our family. Um, and it is why we set boundaries. And if you've listened to this, you've heard us say this 1,000 times that boundaries aren't punishments for other people.
Right.
They are for you. They are yours. And we in our workshop, which we're going to schedule one so you can have a sneak peek, but we talk about like the boundaries being like, who are you letting in your yard?
Yes. Yeah.
But it's yours. It's keeping you safe. Um, so just quickly, there are a variety of types of boundaries, but there are two kinds of boundaries. Big picture, there are hard boundaries, and these are non-negotiables. These are things you will not compromise on. So everybody, this is going to be different. And these aren't really situation specific boundaries. These are just like
Yeah.
this is the way they are.
Right.
And I'm blanking on any example of this, but I feel like you have one.
Well, so I like the second sentence you have here, and they're the make or break situations that you'll never accept, you'll never do. So maybe your hard boundary is you're never going to reverse down the highway to get to your exit, right? Like maybe that's a hard boundary for you. I'm just thinking about that because that popped up in a show I watched yesterday, and I was like, that's
Sure.
yeah, we shouldn't be doing that. Um, so maybe that's your hard boundary. I mean, they could be more obvious, like your hard boundary is your partner cannot put their hands on you and in an aggressive way, and that could be a hard boundary for you. I think it should be a hard boundary for everybody, but that's just me. Um, but there, those are the kinds of things that are like absolutes. This is never going to happen in my life, or I'm never going to allow this in, that kind of thing.
Right. And I think that there are hard boundaries. And then unfortunately, there are things that we think of are hard boundaries that end up being more situational than we realize. And that's when
Yeah.
things get scary and sticky.
Yes.
Um, Soft boundaries are more flexible. So these could be things that you're willing to compromise on, or negotiate or accept within reason. They're, a description calls them wishes or setting goals. I I feel I understand that description, but to me, soft boundaries are more like boundaries that you're willing to like are situational, right? So
Yeah.
where you might accept something from one person or you might demand something from one person for your relationship, you don't necessarily demand it from anyone or have that expectation from everyone.
Yeah. So an example in my mind is like there are things Tova could say to me that I'd be like, yeah, fine. That if somebody else said them to me, I would be like, no, that's not a part of our relationship. We're not going to have
Yes.
these discussions. You're not going to say these types of things to me. So that's what I think you mean by situational and
Yeah.
circumstantial, right? Like it depends on who I'm talking to at any given moment as to how I will like what information I will allow in, what
Yeah.
types of feedback I'm willing to take. There's a lot of different things that could apply in these soft boundaries, but I think that's one, you know, prime example that everyone has experienced.
Yeah, and I think like it's situational in, who are you talking to? Obviously, is it a work colleague? Is it a personal relationship? It is a family member. I think for me, a lot of those boundaries and the negotiating of them has to do with the trust I have with the other person
Mm-hmm.
and whether I trust them to have good boundaries. So, if you've been listening all along, you know that one of my big goals has been to learn how to set boundaries. And it has been something that I have never done before intentionally. What I have found though is that I am attracted to people who set good boundaries in friendship.
Yeah.
And so as I started setting boundaries with my friends, I realized that it had no effect on my relationship with my best friends and my closest friends because they were good boundary setters and
Right.
boundaries already existed in our relationship because they had set them. And so then me setting them was like, oh, she's just getting in line. This literally, it does not affect us at all. But
Right.
you'll find that there will be situations um, where you set a boundary. And this is when we talk about how this is why it can be so important to do it just right from the jump start. But when you're going back and you're like, okay, I need to set some boundaries here. And you're going to have friends who are like, I'm not good with that.
Right.
And because they liked the you that didn't set boundaries,
Right.
they liked that relationship.
Maybe you were more of a doormat in the relationship. I hate using that term, but I don't know what else to call it. And you wake up and you realize, oh, this is not how I want to be treated, and you set different boundaries, and the other person may have a hard time dealing with that. The other thing I wanted to circle back to is I think the reason you Tova and myself, of course, are attracted to people who set boundaries is that it creates that feeling of safety, right?
Yeah,
Like if you're in a relationship with another person who is good at setting boundaries, it makes you feel more secure and safe. And that
100%.
obviously is a very attractive feeling, right? Like we
Well,
all want that in our relationships.
one thing I love about being in relationships with people who set boundaries is if I ask for something, like usually it's time, hey, can you come over? Or hey, can you help me out with I'm going to have a major surgery. Can you come and help me? If I know they set good boundaries, I feel comfortable asking for that
Yeah.
and know that if they can't, they'll say no.
Right.
Like, or if they don't want to, and not even, I don't mean can't as in like they couldn't possibly rearrange their schedule, but if they're like, life is overwhelming right now, all this stuff, I really can't do it right now. I'm like, cool, like that's fine. And I feel
Yeah.
good knowing, like, I know that sounds weird, but when we get into like this frientimacy, which I can't really say,
Yeah, that's hard.
one of the things about setting boundaries is you have to be vulnerable to be able to do them well. And so I know that if I ask a friend who sets good boundaries for something, I can feel comfortable even asking for a lot, which I've had to do a lot over the last 5 years. And if they can't do it, they will say no. And that's okay with me.
Right, because you're secure in the knowledge that that no has nothing to do with you as a person and
Sure.
your relationship, right? And that the yes, if it comes, is because they really want to and are able to do the thing that you're asking for and they're happy to do it, right? Like that's a level of security that we don't often get in our relationships where the boundaries are not well defined. And I want to keep us moving, but like let's talk about how boundaries can become like over defined and under defined, and like there's a little bit of a Goldilocks effect, right? Like
Yeah. Well, because and you and I have talked about this because we have been on the extreme ends of these
yeah,
boundaries where we have I have weak, porous boundaries, right? And these develop when you have a hard time saying no,
right,
where you take on more responsibility in a relationship than you should, or you tend to overshare, or and it leads you to resent other people. I mean, it can
mm,
lead to a whole include and burnout. It leads to burnout.
absolutely.
And listen, we've talked about how society has led us to burnout, but that's for another conversation.
Yeah, but
Um,
society often doesn't recognize or encourage good boundaries.
well, there's that it's not a meme, but like that reel or short or whatever, where it's like, a mom usually sitting in the car and it's like, stop doing all the things. And then the mom's like, who's going to effing do them?
Right.
And so, society has said, no, this is your job, then this is your job, and this is your job, and this is your job. And you have to say no a lot more than we probably should have to say no to keep our
Right.
sanity. And I
Right.
mean sanity in the official sense of the term.
Right. Absolutely.
But then there's rigid boundaries, right? I don't know if you want to describe these a little
Well,
bit
yeah,
because,
so there can be you can have both. Let's be very
yeah.
clear. You can go in
Mm-hmm.
both directions at any given time. But when we're talking about rigid boundaries, we're talking more about like, did you build a castle wall around yourself, right? Do you have a moat? Are there alligators in the moat? Like, we obviously think in pictures, so we talk in pictures a lot.
Yeah.
But like, this is a way to think about what are your boundaries actually keeping everyone out and not allowing you to have solid, healthy relationships, right? And
Well,
I've definitely been there and it's I don't think it's any more comfortable than having these like porous, everybody walks all over you boundaries.
yeah. And I think, a good question is this boundary actually keeping me safe?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes rigid ones aren't keeping you safe. You think they are, but if you really think about it and you think about like, this isn't allowing me to have a close friendship with somebody, this
Yeah.
isn't allowing me to trust people. And by the way, both rigid and weak boundaries, overly rigid and weak boundaries, can be trauma responses to a maybe growing up in a household that wasn't secure. Not always, but they can be, where
Yeah.
you're like, the only way I'm going to protect myself is if I am very rigid, or the only way I can protect myself is if I'm very flexible.
Right.
Um, so let's take a quick break. And then I want to come back and talk about the different types. So these are a different type of different types of boundaries. And there's a lot of different ways, and I don't know that we always think of them this way. So let's take a quick break and we will be right back. Hey there, pod family. Have you ever wished you could stay in the loop with a little slice of transformation and inspiration delivered straight to your inbox? Well, you're in luck because now you can. Introducing our fantastic newsletter, your VIP pass to all things exciting and informative. Join our community of growth minded souls. Get the hottest topics delivered right to your inbox. It's quick, easy, and totally free. Just head over to our website at goboldlyinitiative.com and sign up for our newsletter today. Don't miss out on the next big thing. Stay connected with us. Subscribe now and get ready for some big, bold love. Okay, welcome back. So we are going to talk about a different type of boundaries, right? So there's hard and soft, there's rigid and porous, but there's other types, right? So there are physical boundaries, and these could be with regard to your privacy. It could be something like at your workspace at work, like this is my private area, you don't come into this area. It could be, if you have a roommate, like who's allowed to come in to your space. With my kids, they all share a room, so it's very hard, but like they're not allowed on each other's beds without permission. And it's a big violation if they go on somebody's bed without permission. They each have their own little lockbox. Now I get the number for the lockbox, but they each have their own little lockbox so that they can get in and keep their secret private things in there. And usually those are like stickers at this age, but
Yeah.
um, and so, a physical boundary as a mom could be like the bathroom door shut, which should be automatic, but never is.
No.
Um, it can also be like, I don't know, a personal space, body, how you feel about someone touching you, not in a sexual way, but you find people who are just like not huggers or don't like to be touched, or, a variety of things like that.
Yeah, so I can speak to that because I fall in that category of people who I don't like strangers touching me and I only like people touching me when I want them to. My husband says I'm like a cat. Which is not inaccurate. But
Interesting. And I'm more like a dog.
yeah, well, and he's more like a dog. It's fun. Um But the reason for that, for me, just to be clear for everyone else, is that I struggle with energy boundaries. And this
Yeah.
is, we're not going to get too deep into the energy boundaries today, but like when people touch me, I feel like their energy gets on me. And that can be super uncomfortable if they're like anxious or depressed or angry or sad or whatever. It's very hard for me not to absorb that feeling into my body and then figure out like what's mine and what's theirs. So I developed over my entire lifetime a habit of not really touching strangers or like people that I'm not prepared to deal with their energy. And so I think a lot of people experience that without realizing that's what they're experiencing.
I think it's huge. And I think that that is something that I have experienced before, but never had that language until working with you of of being able to like be like, oh, they have good energy. And like, and I think it can be a matter, and I think you can feel it off a stranger. You can feel it off at somebody like if you like to, I don't know, you like the owner at a coffee shop, even though you don't know them. It feels good to be there. They have good energy. You
Yeah.
feel, we were just talking the other day about Beyonce, and we're like, she has good energy. Like,
Yeah,
and we don't
absolutely.
mean it in that she's like hyper or something. We
No,
mean it that
no.
it's this where you're like, okay, we don't know her personally, but we feel like she has this
She's got good
strong,
vibes.
good
Like it's a
vibes.
good
Yeah.
aura. I mean, if you go down the rabbit hole of woo, it's like a really strong positive aura, right?
Well,
That
and
she
I
puts out in the world.
I kind of love that our generation of kids, like our middle school generation, talks about vibes.
Yeah.
Like it's a I and they actually I really do think they mean it in this way. Like
Yeah,
when
I
they're like,
agree.
this place is vibing, you're like, oh, it means it has good energy. And I love that they're paying attention to that. The little weirdos that they are with all their new words. Um, so okay, so a couple more types of boundaries. Sexual, obviously. So these are your preferences, expectations, and concerns around intimacy. This is what falls under sexual boundaries. Um, and this is very important to know where your boundaries are. Or to be with somebody you trust to say, hey, this is the boundary I set before. I don't know if I still need it to be there. I don't know. Like, let's explore. But that's
Right.
still setting a boundary. Um, and I think we've talked about, or we haven't talked about, but the world talks about when those are violated.
Hmm.
Emotional boundaries, this very similar to the energy setting, protecting your emotional well-being is when you're setting emotional boundaries. This screams like family to me and friendships, but they include not just who you share your personal feelings with, but how other people's feelings affect you. And that's a boundary
Yeah.
that you set within yourself. Like, am I going to let Aunt Judy's comments get to me?
Right.
Disclaimer, I don't think either of us have an Aunt Judy.
No.
Am I going to let that into to me? And also, am I willing to share things that will open myself up to ridicule from Aunt Judy? No, I am not, and that's a boundary. All those, by the way, are boundaries that you set that theoretically Aunt Judy doesn't know that you're setting.
Right. So the other person doesn't need to participate, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, often doesn't participate in the boundary setting. It's you setting, excuse me, it's you setting the boundary for yourself.
Yes. And they can also to refer to not just emotions, but beliefs, ideas, values. This is something that we have been talking about a lot in our women's circle over the last couple of
Hmm.
weeks, as we haven't actually used the word boundaries, but this is 100% what we've been talking about, as we've been talking about, if we have a different reaction to something on social media, or, the what's happening on the conversation in social media, or as we prepare for the upcoming or current presidential election and or the conflict in Israel and Gaza, like how where do we draw our lines, right? And those are personal boundaries, and like the people that I unfollow on social media don't know that I'm doing that. The
Yeah.
family members who I make an point not to have certain conversations with, they don't know that we're doing that. But we are individually, we are making those decisions.
Yeah.
Um, just as an aside, we're going to get to the how-tos quickly, but um, it can be incredibly helpful if there's somebody in your life who knows your boundaries about some of these things. Just, I know we're going to get to that, but like it can be so empowering when you're walking into a family event and you verbalized within maybe your car as you're driving up the boundaries that you're all setting together.
Yeah.
So it is a very individual thing, but it's something you can share with others. I'll just set that.
Yeah, you can
Um,
get like a support around getting
yeah.
support around setting challenging boundaries, especially with family, which
Yes.
everyone that's hard for everyone, but
Yep.
getting support around that is one of, as you said, Tova, we'll get to the how to in a
Yeah,
minute, but
but it
like
just
that's like such an essential part of it, I think.
yep. There's material boundaries, and these also are financial boundaries. So like you can be a generous person and still say no.
Yeah.
And figuring out where your line is. And, we are in some financial money groups together online, and there's always a conversation of like, do you lend money to your family? Do you lend money to friends? And often it is like, I do, but I don't expect to get it back. Like I
Right.
want to get it back, but I don't expect to get it back. Or I do expect to get it back, and then it takes longer than I think it should, like, or whatever. People have different boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Or I have a payment plan that we put into place. Like people have different lines. And other people are like, I never lend money to friends or family. Um, and so there's not a right or wrong answer to how and where you draw your line. Um, and we're going to get to the hows very soon, but like one of the big important parts is knowing where you draw your line. That's
Yeah.
like step number one.
And accepting that it's okay for you to draw that line, right? Like
Yes.
I I know myself well enough to know that I don't loan money to friends because when I do, then I get like micromanaging about how they use their money. And that's
Yeah.
not cool. Like that's not it's not okay for me to do that. But I can't help myself. Like I have struggled to not do that. So I just don't lend money. Like I'll do other things that where I don't feel so micromanaging and like I have to be uptight about things. But, like you just have to know yourself well enough and accept these parts of yourself. Like I'm not going to
Yeah.
feel ashamed about that. I'm not going to judge myself for
Well,
that.
by the way, I did not know that about you, and I am so relieved. And had I have borrowed money from friends over the last few years, and it's been like hey, I need to get over this next week before my next paycheck. Can I borrow? I'll pay you back at this date. But I've never asked you, but it's wonderful knowing that if I would have ever asked you, you would say no.
Yeah.
That's great. Like it is so nice. And you would say no, that has no reason to do with me.
Right.
And I
It's
don't need
actually entirely about me.
Right. And I don't need to know your reason, but it's great to know that. And
Yeah.
and I think that is the lovely thing about being around people who have boundaries. And it's why we encourage people to make boundaries, because it gives other people relief.
Right.
Um, so the last big boundary, and these are in all the articles, these five, I believe, boundaries. Time,
Yeah.
right? Allowing other people to have access to your time, figuring out where you want your time to go. I don't like all those memes that are like, it's not that you don't have enough time, it's that you have different priorities. No, Karen, a lot of us don't have enough time.
Don't actually have the time.
Yeah, we have
Yeah.
kids. Okay, my kids feeding them is a priority. You got me. But like, sorry. It drives me crazy. It's like, well, you could get that done at 11 o'clock at night if you weren't watching TV. And it's
Right.
like,
But then the next day they're going to be like, you should really get better sleep.
yeah. And also, like, you
Okay.
should give yourself a treat. And I'm like, yeah, my treat was watching Netflix, Karen. Sorry, Karens. I
Poor
love,
Karens. You've
I
been
have
ruined.
friends who are Karens.
Same.
So I have a funny story about Karens another time. We don't have time today. Um, but this is where you want to say, do I say no? Or, and this is where we have talked, like, if it's not a hell yes, it's a
Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
right? And the other thing, and I appreciate when people do this, just because, and I'm trying to teach my kids these things, just because somebody is theoretically at home doing, quote, nothing, doesn't mean they're available to spend time with you.
Right.
Like,
Right. Yeah, that's
it,
a hard one for people to accept. Like that somebody might actually just want to be on their own doing something quietly.
right. And it's something that I have to actively remind myself to do on weekends that like I don't have the kids, of finding that balance of like, I want to see people. I might be like there, and sometimes it happens that I might be overbooked because people then no one cancels. But I also don't want to be totally by myself. So I
Right.
have to book stuff and then everybody cancel. It's like a whole weird thing. But it is okay to say no to sharing your time with other people.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is your time. It is theoretically, the most important resource we have and the most finite resource we have. Like we can't
Yeah.
make more time.
No, that's a
Um,
really good point. Um, let's talk a little bit about I mean, we've talked at length about why boundaries.
yeah.
Um, but let's just note that, if you're not setting healthy boundaries in your life, you're gonna wind up burnt out. You're gonna wind up, what did you say before? Resentful. That's the word I
Yeah.
wanted. And, what you put here is like your relationships can become toxic and unsatisfying, and your well-being can suffer. Right? That doesn't
Well,
sound fun. Let's not get there.
and if you read some of those articles about like what leads people to divorce and what's hardest to come back from, resentment is like a huge one.
It's so heavy. Resentment
Yeah.
is a real heavy feeling to carry around, much like anger. Um, it really weighs down your energy. It makes it harder to do anything else because you're sitting there thinking about how resentful you are or how angry you are or both.
Yeah.
And those things are very heavy to carry. And, you said this before, but boundaries really come into play at work. I think it's important. It can be harder to set them at work if you have a work culture that doesn't appreciate boundaries.
Mm.
Um, but you can still do it. You can still find a way to do it. And I like this list you have here of what healthy boundaries can do, and they can
Yes.
encourage your autonomy and reduce your codependent habits. I mean, that sounds like a big mouthful, but basically it means you can do things on your own for yourself. Um, it can also set expectations for your interactions with other people, give you a sense of empowerment and self-respect, ensure your physical and emotional comfort. And then I think this might be the one of the most important parts is that, it separates your wants, needs, thoughts, and feelings from those of other people. This can be if you're an empathetic person, which I hope you are, but also if you're somebody like myself, where you're an actual empath and other people's feelings and stuff sticks to you. Boundaries are essential to help you deal with that and figure out how to separate out what's yours and what belongs to somebody else and is not your responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if you are easily codependent, I don't know, learning that like you don't have to take on other people's stuff is
Mhm.
so big. And it is so easy to take it on. And we're going to talk about after our next break how to set boundaries. And one of the ways is verbalizing. And I know what they mean is I think what they mean is like telling somebody else what your boundary is.
Yeah.
And sometimes that happens, but for me, a lot of it is verbalizing. I know this person is sharing this with me and I don't have to fix it for them. And whether it's me writing it in my journal or saying to Riley, like, I'm not going to fix it. I know I could fix it. I think I could fix it because I love to fix things for other people, but I'm not going to because they don't need me to fix it. And
Right.
that is me setting a boundary with myself that this other person had no idea I was doing. But I verbalized it because I needed to say it out loud to give myself the support.
Yeah.
Um, so the other things, and these are the whys, I think we know them, but we've talked about how they can give you security. Setting boundaries can increase your self-compassion and boost your self-esteem because you are taking care of yourself. They can help avoid anxiety when we don't have our emotional boundaries in place or when they're not being respected. It can feel like we're being bullied. It can leave us anxious. It can leave us overwhelmed. Those aren't emotional boundaries. Those can be material boundaries and time boundaries. And then it can lead to healthy relationships, which is pretty great.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, our kids watch us and they pick up whether, are we going to be resentful if we say yes to something that we don't want to say yes to? Even to them. I
Yeah.
think kids appreciate, I mean, they don't act like it, but they appreciate when you're like, I can't do that right now.
Right.
Because they know that when you do something, you're going to be in it and you're going to be excited.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. We should take a break.
yeah.
So let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to go through this amazing list of how to set your boundaries. So we'll be right back, everyone. Well, hey there, Dream Chaser. Are you ready to make the next 12 months of your life unforgettable? Introducing the Year of You, a groundbreaking new goal system group that's about to redefine the way we approach personal growth. Join us with a community of like minded individuals committed to unlocking their full potential with expert guidance, personalized strategies, kind hearted accountability, and a supportive network. The Year of You is more than just a goal setting group, it's a whole movement. Don't just dream about it, achieve it. Click in the link in our show notes or go ahead and visit us at goboldlyinitiative.com/year review to learn more today. Let's embark on a transformative journey together towards becoming the best versions we can be. The Year of You, where your goals become reality. Welcome back to the show. So, before the break, we promised you we would get to how to set boundaries, and we are here. Woo! And Tova, you have this whole list of like the things you can do to set boundaries, and which I love because that's the purpose of this show. But the first one that you have here is think through what you need or want to accomplish by setting the boundary. So the why of it all. Like, why do you want to set this boundary? What is it going to do for you? And that can be really hard, to be honest, sometimes to know. I mean, there are some times where it's super obvious, right? Like I'm setting this boundary around money because I don't have enough money to lend to anyone today. And so I'm not gonna lend money, right? Like that could be you if that was your boundary that you were setting, that would be very obvious. But it could be much harder. It could be I'm not going to lend money. This took me a long time to understand. I'm not going to lend money because I know that that creates a lot of anxiety and stress in me and creates uncomfortable relationships, right? So but I didn't know that right away. Like I had to figure
Right.
that out. Um
Yeah.
so to you know to figure out like the why behind the boundary you need to set is sort of the first step.
And I think that it's the first step. It ties in with some of the other things like determine, and this might even be before because it's going to help you figure out what boundaries to set, but determining what your priorities are in your work in your life. And your priority may be like, I don't want to be anxious about how other people spend their money.
Yeah.
Or letting personal values be your guide, right? Like, so figuring out first, what are your personal values? So shout out to our Defining You mission statement course or our recommendation to pick a word of the year or a phrase of the year and figuring out, you know, how we are going to shape what our priorities are, how we know what our personal values are, but maybe we haven't thought about them in a long time. And so doing some digging to figure out what they are. And then usually that's going to lead you to your whys when it comes to
Yeah.
setting boundaries. And that can be, it can happen in reverse, right? You can be like, I feel uncomfortable when this happens. I feel uncomfortable in this situation and I don't know why. So then you back it up and you think, well, what is happening in this situation? And how is that not in alignment with how I want to live my life? And then
Yeah.
you're like, oh, okay, because this is happening. And now I know why I need to set these boundaries.
Right.
Um, so that's kind of the behind the work. And if you are following along, how to set boundaries, how to set habits, how to set goals. There was another one right before that I don't remember. But all of these have that same, like, you need to do the work first to figure out what are your personal values and
Yeah.
what are your priorities.
I mean, it makes it so much easier when you have that sort of understanding when you've done that work and you're like, okay, my values and my priorities are, X, Y, and Z. And now I can look at the world in a very different way and understand that if these are my priorities and values, and if this is my core mission in my life, this is my purpose, then how is what I'm doing aligning with that purpose or not aligning? And is it
Right.
getting in the way of other things that I could be doing that do align with my purpose, right? Like that's also something that comes into play.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And then I think, the next sort of stage, and this is if you haven't given a lot of thought to any boundary setting in your life, and you probably are setting some that you don't know that you're setting,
yeah,
but I mean, I assume you are, you're just laying down at night exhausted with no money and sad. So hopefully that's not happening. And that means you're
Oh,
naturally setting boundaries.
right.
And I think some of the best boundary setters do it without thinking about it because they had healthy boundaries set with them growing up. And
Yeah.
you're like,
What's
oh,
that like?
that's cool.
That's nice.
Um, so
Sorry.
you want to evaluate your relationships. You want to recognize that different relationships require different boundaries. And so figuring out, oh, when Jane from the office says this, it makes me feel uncomfortable. But when my neighbor says this, it doesn't.
Right.
And I think that means I'm closer with my neighbor and she's sort of in the inner, she's in my yard. I let her in my yard, both
Yeah.
figuratively and literally.
Yes. Yes.
Um, and sometimes I think, there's this whole phenomenon of work colleagues knowing a lot of your personal stuff because they're never going to cross over.
Yeah.
And then you kind of have to figure out if you do have friends who make that leap from colleagues to personal, where you're like, oh, now you know all this stuff about all the people in this room. What am I going to do now?
Right. I mean,
Um,
but it also is so relationship dependent. Like
yes.
whether it's at the workplace, outside of the workplace, in your own family, parents of your kids' friends, like whoever it is,
Yeah.
it's going to vary by person. Now, not for your rigid boundaries, really, because those are things that they are what they are. But for everything else, it's going to vary depending on who you're reacting with or who you're relating to and who you're interacting with. And that is 100% okay. Like you don't have to be exactly the same with it's not black and white. You don't have to be
Yeah.
exactly the same with every single person. And I know that most people know that, but knowing it and accepting it and saying it out loud and hearing it and letting it like sink into your mind, body, spirit is a totally different
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. I think that um, if you do see boundaries black and white, that goes back to those rigid
Yeah.
things. And this is where it is helpful to, we haven't said this in a while, but to work with a therapist.
I
Like
was just thinking that.
if you find your boundaries to be too rigid or
Hmm.
too weak, too porous, I like the idea of rigid and porous because it gives me a visual.
Hmm.
I'm thinking like brick walls, concrete walls, and then I'm thinking
Sponge.
the yeah, a sponge or like the thing that you put the pasta in to
Oh,
like
a
with the
colander.
there we go. A strainer,
Strainer.
colander. Yeah, exactly. I think, if that's how you're picturing it, or if you think about it, you're just like, oh wow, I haven't let people in. Like, yeah, I have these great boundaries. Nobody hurts me. But guess what? Are you making,
Right.
really wonderful connections with people?
Right.
So these are never bad times to work with a therapist or reach out to us to chat. And we promise that if we, as big people who love therapy, or therapy who love whatever, you know what I mean? People who love therapy, if we think that this is something beyond what we just going to talk through and you need to go to a therapist, we will tell you that.
100%. We'll probably tell you that whether or not
Yeah.
it's something that we have experience and
Well,
skill in.
yeah, and to be perfectly honest, we both love the combo of a coach and a therapist
Yeah.
because you can be dealing with two things, or I mean, oftentimes I will be dealing with the same thing but from different angles, and it's
Right.
just like a great tag team.
Right.
So I like this idea of carving out time for yourself. I think that as a how to, like saying, this is my time, whether it is your coffee time in the morning, Riley, or an
Mm-hmm.
hour or two alone on the weekends, or my non negotiable reading time or walking time. I think it is a great way to practice setting boundaries and B, a great way to actually set boundaries and
Right.
benefit from them.
Right.
um, the other one, and this is, whether it's speak up or verbalize, when you start setting boundaries, um, you may need to verbalize what is going on. Um, and you might need to say, hey, this isn't going to work for me anymore. Because if you have been in a relationship without boundaries for a very long time, um, they might not notice you trying to set this boundary. They might assume that you're not trying to set a boundary because you've never done it before. And it may not be intentional, it may not be mean, it may just be a lack of awareness.
Yeah. And let's be honest, like most people aren't going to be like, oh, that's person is setting a boundary, right? They're going to be like, why do they hate me? They're not doing what I want them to do every single day, right? Like
Yeah.
that's how people are often going to react. People are
Yeah.
reactive. And so then the conversation needs to happen of like, this isn't about you. This is about me. And this is for me. And this is why I'm doing these things. That is an extraordinarily uncomfortable conversation to have with most people. Um, but it's a worthwhile discomfort. It's a good discomfort of like, okay, I'm doing this thing. And personally, I would start with the person you will be the least uncomfortable with,
Yeah.
right? In having those conversations, whoever that is, if it's your mom, if it's your best friend, your spouse, whatever. Um, and just have that initial conversation of, look, I realize this is what's going on, and I really need to be better about guarding my time because I'm totally overwhelmed and underwater,
Yeah.
right? And you don't really have to justify it, but it's helpful to explain it to people. And
Well,
that,
yeah, I think sometimes doing it to the people that you wouldn't even need to verbalize it to,
yeah,
who are just picking it up and who are like, probably, and I've talked about this before. I highly recommend reading The Year of Yes. I read it every year. I'm actually due to read it again soon. And Shonda Rhimes, who no one would describe as a doormat, but was very good at just saying yes,
yeah,
even when she didn't want to. And when she started setting boundaries, her good friends cheered her on. And her friends who liked her because she didn't set good boundaries pushed back.
right.
And she realized that they were not good friends. Because guess what?
Yeah.
Good friends are excited for you to figure out what you need to be happy and healthy and safe.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a pretty handy culling tool.
it certainly is.
As
And
awful as that
which
sounds.
goes right next to the next thing. Pay attention to relationship changes and walk away if needed.
Yeah.
When you are establishing healthy boundaries, so we're not talking about the brick walls, we're talking about healthy boundaries. And the people who are used to you being this doormat get irritated or upset, you know why they liked you.
Right.
Well, Tova always says yes. Tova always can help. Tova, like, and then suddenly and it can be because I've had this experience where I got caught up with somebody into gossiping.
Yeah.
And it was not, I think sometimes, like in a family, like gossiping is often just sharing necessary information to support people in your family.
Yeah.
Like it's not gossiping.
Yeah.
Um, and that's how it felt like it started with this friend, and then it felt bad.
Right.
And I set a boundary, and we are not good friends anymore. I don't know that we are ever good friends, but we are not because I'm not a person to gossip with. And
Yeah.
I'm also not a person to engage and take on all of her emotional stress. Because I set some personal boundaries and I had to verbalize those to other people, by the way, and be like, this is what I'm doing. I didn't verbalize them to her. But I need to verbalize these things to other people. So
Yeah.
the point is, it does help you figure out that this might not. And by the way, that works with can't really not with bosses, but in a way, bosses. And it works with jobs. I mean, it helps you figure out a lot when
Yeah, it
you
helps
finally
you
start setting
understand
boundaries.
it's going to help you understand your relationships, right? And where I don't want to put people on like a tier system or like anything like that, but it helps you understand where you're at with people and where they are and what's important to them and how that relates to what's important to you.
Yeah.
Um and it may not we talk about it like it's so clear and obvious. It's not. Like it may take some work and it might take some like intentional contemplation of other people's reactions to you, of what's important to you, all of these things. Like it takes some underlying work to get through this process.
Well, and that, I mean, not to jump ahead to the homework, but as we're talking about the how to, it's our homework, right? We're
Yeah.
going to talk about looking around and figuring out what are some boundaries we need to set, right? And so, a good way, there's, why don't we start with test a hard boundary, test
Yep.
out one hard boundary. And like you said, this could be I never drive backwards on the highway. This could be an easy one to test out.
Yeah.
Like, and maybe you've just never thought about it as a boundary, right? So this is where we're going to say take us some time and think about the priorities in your life. Think about what you value and think about maybe you are already setting a hard boundary. figure out what it is and give yourself a pat on the back
Yeah.
because
And
you're doing it already.
if you're a parent, you're setting hard boundaries. Like they're there, right? You just
Yeah.
may not realize they're boundaries. That there's things that you're like, we're not doing this. Like this is not happening. I'm not, or there's things that you're like, I know parents who never swear in front of their kids, like ever. And that is their hard boundary. I am not that parent, despite my best efforts. But like there are people where that's their hard boundary.
Yeah.
And that's great. But like if that's you, like you just said, Tova, acknowledge that that's what you're doing and you've set
Yeah.
that boundary for yourself.
Yeah. So yeah, you figure out like these are my non-negotiables. If you feel like there are things that you want to be non-negotiables in your life and you're not doing them, then that's when it's time to test out one, right? Test out one hard boundary that you do want to set. And it's going to be hard. Like let's
Yeah.
just be honest. It is going to be hard. You're going to stumble. Somebody pushing back at the beginning does not mean they are a bad friend. It does
No.
not mean that they're a bad person, about spouse. Like it can be hard, especially when you haven't set them from the beginning. So one of the big tips is, right, like setting boundaries at the beginning of your
Yeah.
relationships. But if you're new to boundaries, you can't do that because you have friends already. So think about what's important to you, set that hard boundary. Then the next one is like practice setting a few soft boundaries. And these can be boundaries. I mean, I say boundaries with yourself. All boundaries are boundaries with yourself, but this could be something like a nighttime routine.
Yeah.
Like, and I think sometimes soft boundaries can turn into hard boundaries, and honestly, hard boundaries can turn into soft boundaries.
Yeah.
Um,
Sometimes we need hard boundaries to like reset ourselves or
yeah.
to get ourselves to a place where we're more comfortable and willing to expand those into something else.
Well, like right now, the boys and I are struggling. They have been really unkind with each other, and
Hmm.
they're using certain words that's a non-negotiable that they cannot use those words in my house. And I let them swear, but there are certain words
Yeah.
that they just cannot use. And so we have two things going. It's a stick and a carrot situation. There was no actual stick involved, just so we're clear. My kids do like carrots, so maybe there'd be carrots. But like we're keeping a tally, kind of like nobody was injured for 19 days,
Right.
right? We are keeping a tally on our fridge for how many days in a row have we spoken kindly to each other. We're just going to see how many we can get. We're going to get rewards, whatever. But I have already warned them that there will be severe consequences and maybe disproportionate consequences, they feel like, until we stop using these words. And we've identified the three words. One has never been used, but it's been threatened. And then there've been two words. And those will be, loss of devices for the like it's going to be like bigger than I would normally do
Yep.
because we need to have a hard boundary until we get better.
Yeah, I think this is such a good example, right? And we need to wrap up, but like I just want to highlight this that you can set a very hard boundary like in parenting or in a relationship or, with a family member until you are comfortable enough and the other person has learned enough that you
Yes.
can then move it to a softer boundary.
And until you've learned about that person and that you can trust them.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
then we do need to wrap it up. So let's test out a few soft boundaries. Let's figure out what those are. Riley and I will think of some for ourselves and share them this week, what we're going to be working on. You've heard my hard boundary right now. I will take all of your support. And then the last one is, commit, right? Commit to how, um, to doing these. Whether you commit for a week, I would say boundaries, it needs to be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, so that you actually get some exposure to different people. But commit and then see what are the positive things that are happening? What are the negative things that are happening? Like what boundaries are serving you and helping you feel safer, valued, and respected, and what boundaries are actually not important to you?
Yeah.
Because guess what? Don't waste energy on making boundaries that you don't need to make. So anyway, that is our homework. We could talk endlessly about this. We do. We love it. We'll be scheduling a workshop sometime this year. We
Yes.
don't remember when, but we'll let you know.
We'll
Uh,
share the workshop information when we share this episode on social media.
Yep.
And as Tova said, try out some boundaries over the next few weeks. Let us know how it goes. Reach out to us on social media at Go Boldly Together. feel free to DM us, feel free to tag us, whatever works for you works for us. And that is pretty much it for this week. I'm sure we'll talk about boundaries again. But next week we'll be back with another how-to in living your limitless life. So stick with us, everyone. We'll talk to you all very soon.
Thanks so much for listening to We Go Boldly podcast. We know you're busy and we love spending time with you.
If you enjoyed this week's episode, let us know. Head to Apple Podcasts right now to rate and review our show. While you're there, be sure to click that subscribe button.
Want more us time? Follow us on all the socials at Go Boldly Together.
Want even more us time? As in all the coaching pizzazz. Find us at goboldlyinitiative.com for all the info.
We will be back with more excitement, research, and deep thoughts next week.
Until then, keep on being the bold, brave, amazing people we know you already are.